We were just trying to visit family, that's it. Nothing crazy, nothing illegal, just a normal visit, like we had done so many times before. But this time, something was different. As we pulled up to the neighborhood, we were met with a notice. Bold letters screaming at us. Non-residents are no longer allowed to visit without prior approval. At first we thought it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. There was no way they could actually stop us from visiting our own relatives, right? But then we saw them. A couple of HOA board members standing at the entrance, arms crossed, watching us like we were criminals. One of them walked up, smug as ever, and told us we had to turn around. "New rule," he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Visitors aren't allowed without written permission from the HOA. That's when it sank in. They weren't joking. They weren't misunderstanding anything. They had made a rule, just for us. My family was banned from an entire neighborhood. And for what? Just for existing? What they didn't know was, my father is a judge, and he wasn't going to let this slide. My family has always been close. We aren't the kind of people who just see each other on holidays. We visit, we check in, we make time." That's why we were at my grandparents' house so often. They had lived in that neighborhood for over 20 years, long before there was even an HOA. Back then, it was just a quiet, friendly place where people minded their own business. But once the HOA took over, everything changed. This HOA wasn't just strict. They were obsessed with control. They weren't protecting the neighborhood. They were running it like a dictatorship. They fined people for things that didn't even make sense. My grandparents once got a warning because their trash can was 3 inches too far from the curb. Another neighbor was fined because his grass was too tall. It was barely half an inch higher than the rule allowed. And kids? They might as well have been criminals. No bikes on the sidewalks, no chalk drawings, no playing outside after a certain time. It was ridiculous. Even with all their rules, we never had a problem visiting before. We'd drive in, park in the driveway, and spend the afternoon catching up. My grandpa loved grilling, and my grandma always made sure we left with leftovers. It was just normal family time. But that day, when we pulled up, something felt off. The first thing we noticed was a bright red sign near the entrance, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the usual "no soliciting" or "slow down for children" sign. It was a list of new visitor restrictions. My dad slowed the car down to read it, his eyebrows pulling together. "No visitors without HOA approval," he read aloud. What the hell? We didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just for solicitors or Airbnb guests. But as we drove up to my grandparents' house, we saw something else that made it clear this wasn't just some general rule. It was targeted. 2 HOA board members were standing outside my grandparents' house, waiting. At first, we thought maybe there was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe the HOA members outside my grandparents' house were just doing their usual patrols, looking for someone's grass to measure or a mailbox to complain about. But the second we stepped out of the car, one of them, a middle-aged guy with a clipboard, started walking straight toward us. "Can I help you?" my dad asked, already sounding annoyed. The man looked down at his clipboard, like he was checking a list. "Are you residents of this neighborhood?" he asked, completely ignoring the fact that we had literally just parked in my grandparents' driveway. "My parents live here," my dad said, pointing toward the house. "We're here to visit them." The HOA guy didn't even blink. "That won't be possible," he said. "New policy. Non-residents are no longer allowed to visit without prior approval from the HOA." We all just stood there for a second, trying to process what he had just said. Prior approval? Since when did we need permission to visit family? "That's ridiculous," my dad said. "We've been coming here for years. My parents own this house. We're their guests." The man shrugged. "Doesn't matter. We sent out a notice last week. All guests have to be approved by the HOA at least 2 weeks in advance and can only stay for a reasonable amount of time. I glanced at my grandparents, who were standing in the doorway now, looking just as confused and angry as we were. They hadn't mentioned anything about this rule before. "You sent out a notice?" I asked. "To who?" "To all homeowners," the man said. Like that explained everything. I turned to my grandpa. "Did you get a notice about this?" Grandpa scoffed. "I get 1,000,000 notices from these people. They send letters about the dumbest things. What color our curtains should be, how long we can leave our car in the driveway. Half the time, I don't even open them." That's when it hit me. This wasn't a rule meant for everyone. This was a rule made for us. They didn't expect us to actually show up and challenge it. They probably thought my grandparents would just pass the message along and we'd stop coming over. My dad took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool. "So let me get this straight," he said. "You're telling me that my own parents, who have lived here for decades, can't have their own family visit without asking permission 2 weeks in advance?" "That's correct," the man said. "It's in the new guidelines." I could see my dad clenching his jaw. "And what exactly happens if we don't follow your new guidelines?" The man clicked his pen, ready to write something down. "Well, we'd have to report a violation. Repeat violations could result in fines or even further action." Further action. They were threatening my grandparents in their own home. At that point, my dad had heard enough. He turned to my grandparents and said, "Come on, we're going inside." The HOA guy immediately stepped forward. "Sir, if you enter that house without HOA approval, that's an official violation." My dad laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh you make when you cannot believe how stupid something is. He put his hand on my shoulder and looked the guy straight in the eye. "Go ahead," my dad said. "Report it." And we walked right inside. What they didn't expect was that we weren't going to take this lying down. Once we were inside, my grandparents were fuming. My grandpa kept pacing the living room, muttering about how the HOA had been getting worse every year. My grandma, usually the calm one, was already talking about writing a letter. My dad, on the other hand, sat down at the kitchen table, silent. That was always a bad sign. We decided to handle it the right way first. My grandparents sent an email to the HOA board asking for a meeting to discuss the rule. They explained that this was their home, and they had the right to have family visit whenever they wanted. The response? A copy-paste reply saying that the new policy was already in effect, and that exceptions wouldn't be made. That wasn't good enough. My dad followed up with an email of his own, requesting a formal explanation. This time, the HOA actually responded with more detail, but it was worse than we thought. They claimed that allowing frequent visitors created parking congestion, noise complaints, and safety concerns. Never mind the fact that our car was always parked in the driveway. We never made noise, and my grandparents' house was on a dead-end street. It was obvious they weren't actually worried about these things. They just didn't want us there. Then came the power move. A few days later, my grandparents got a formal letter from the HOA. It wasn't just another warning. It was an official notice that if we continued visiting without approval, they would involve the police for trespassing. Trespassing. On my grandparents' property, that was it. That was the moment the conversation changed from, "How do we fix this?" to, "How do we destroy them?" We sat down that evening and weighed our options. We could stop visiting, sure. But why should we? This was our family. We weren't doing anything wrong. The other option? Fight back. My dad finally spoke up. He had been listening, taking everything in, and when he finally put down his coffee and leaned back in his chair, he smirked. "Well," he said, "they just made a huge mistake." Because what the HOA didn't know was that my dad wasn't just some guy sending angry emails. He was a judge, and if there was one thing he knew better than anyone, it was how to take down people who abused their power. My dad didn't waste time. The moment he realized the HOA had messed up, he went into full judge mode. He pulled out his laptop, grabbed a stack of legal books, and started digging. He loved to act like they were all powerful, but the truth was, they were bound by laws too, and my dad was determined to find where they had crossed the line. First, he looked into the HOA's own rules. He read through every single bylaw, highlighting anything that seemed off. Then, he compared them to state property laws. And that's when he found it the key flaw. It turns out, the HOA had overstepped their legal authority in a major way. Their rule about banning visitors? Completely illegal. Homeowners associations could set certain guidelines for public areas, but they had no right to control who a homeowner could invite into their private residence. That was a direct violation of state property laws. Even worse, their threat to call the police for trespassing? Also illegal. You can't trespass on private property when you're invited by the owner. That was all my dad needed. He put together a legal notice and sent it straight to the HOA board. It was brutal. He laid out exactly how they had broken the law, citing specific cases and state statutes. Then, he hit them with the warning. Revoke the ban immediately or face legal action. We waited for their response, and when it finally came, it was laughable. The HOA board sent back a short, arrogant email, basically saying, "We appreciate your concerns, but our decision stands." They brushed it off like my dad was just some angry homeowner with an empty threat. That was their second mistake, because that's when my dad decided to take it a step further. If they wanted to ban us, we'd ban them, from the entire county. My dad wasn't playing around anymore. The HOA thought they could ignore him, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. He wasn't just going to get the visitor ban overturned. He was going to make sure they regretted ever trying it. The first step was escalating the issue to the county level. Since the HOA had violated property rights laws, my dad had the legal grounds to take it beyond just a civil complaint. He filed an official grievance with the county property board, outlining all the ways the HOA had illegally overstepped their authority. But he didn't stop there. See, when an HOA violates certain laws, they don't just get a slap on the wrist, they can face serious consequences, including fines, restrictions, and even removal of power, and my dad knew exactly how to push for the harshest penalties. Then came the moment the HOA realized they were in deep trouble. A few weeks later, they received an official notice from the county, informing them that their actions were under review. Not just the visitor ban, everything. The county was now investigating their other policies, their past complaints, and whether they had violated any other homeowners' rights. The HOA board panicked. Emergency meetings were scheduled. They scrambled to find legal help, but there was nothing they could do. The laws were clear, and my dad had built an airtight case. They tried to fight back, of course. They filed appeals, tried to justify their decisions, even attempted to rewrite their own rules to cover their tracks. But it was too late. The county had already stepped in, and when the final decision came down, it was brutal. Not only were they forced to revoke the visitor ban immediately, but they were also fined heavily for violating property laws. Even worse for them? The county placed new legal restrictions on the HOA's power, meaning they could no longer enforce a ton of their strictest rules. The same HOA that once fined people for trash cans and grass height? Now they had their own hands tied. And just like that, we went from being banned from the neighborhood to being completely untouchable. After everything came crashing down on the HOA, things started falling apart fast. With the county restrictions in place, their power was basically gutted. They couldn't enforce half of their ridiculous rules anymore, and that made the homeowners furious not at us, but at them. Turns out, we weren't the only ones who hated the HOA. Once people realized the HOA had been breaking the law, they started fighting back too. Other homeowners who had been dealing with unfair fines and nonsense rules started filing their own complaints. Meetings turned into shouting matches. Some board members resigned out of embarrassment. Others tried to hold on, but they were voted out almost immediately. Within a few months, the entire leadership changed, and the best part? The new HOA board wanted nothing to do with the old nonsense. They rolled back a bunch of the stupid rules, focused on actual neighborhood improvements, and made sure nothing like this would ever happen again. The HOA that once banned us? Completely powerless. The first time we visited my grandparents after everything was settled, it felt different. No more glares from board members, no more threats, no more worrying about fines or trespassing notices. We walked in, parked in the same driveway they once tried to stop us from using, and took our time enjoying our visit because there was nothing they could do about it. As we passed by one of the former HOA members, my dad gave them a nod and said, "Nice day, isn't it?" They didn't respond, just turned away and walked off. And that, my friends, is how you deal with an HOA that thinks they're above the law.